My name is Johnny Burtka, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative. On behalf of our staff, I'd like to welcome you to our second annual Crony Capitalism Conference. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor and board member, George D. O'Neill, Jr., for making this event possible. Raise your hand, George. Because of the incredible lineup of speakers and panelists that we have this afternoon, I'll keep my remarks brief. The American Conservative exists to promote a Main Street conservatism that opposes unchecked power in government and business, promotes the flourishing of families and communities through vibrant markets and free people, and embraces realism and restraint in foreign affairs based on America's vital national interests. We accomplish this mission primarily through our print and web publications, through briefing policymakers, scholars, and journalists, as well as through conferences and lectures like you're attending today. When we were founded in 2002, in opposition to the war in Iraq, our aim was both to promote a more peaceful and constitutional approach to U.S. foreign policy and to reignite conversations that people on the right and the left have ignored since the end of the Cold War. And perhaps there's no conversation more ignored and more urgent than that of the crony capitalism, which erodes our institutions, provides special favors for a privileged few, erects economic barriers for working men, women, and entrepreneurs, and fuels the military-industrial complex, along with a whole other host of societal ills. Some say that cronyism is inevitable, but we are here today to tackle this issue head-on. Before we begin our two panels on the military-industrial complex and big tech, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, our board member, Ambassador C. Boyden Gray, to provide an overview of the problem and help frame our conversations. Ambassador Gray is the founding partner of Boyden Gray & Associates, a law and strategy firm in Washington, D.C., focused on constitutional and regulatory issues. Mr. Gray worked in the White House for 12 years, first as counselor to the Vice President during the Reagan administration, and then as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush. In 1993, he received the Presidential Citizens Medal. Under President George W. Bush, Mr. Gray was ambassador to the European Union and U.S. Special Envoy to Europe for Eurasian Energy. Mr. Gray practiced law for 25 years at the firm Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, and was chairman of the Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice Session of the American Bar Association. He is an adjunct professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Boyden Gray to the podium.
It's a pleasure for me to start this conference. People may wonder about, so what do I know about the foreign policy side of it? Well, I was ambassador to the EU, as mentioned, and it was there that I got a brush with the military-industrial complex and the question of Russian collusion. You mentioned the question, what does this have to do with Russian collusion? Well, I lived in a residence that had been refurbished, basically rebuilt by a very, very rich Russian oligarch who was so bad and behaved so badly that he worried for his life and decided he would try to live out his life in Belgium rather than in Moscow. And he bought this house, fixed it up, the most exquisite security coverage that you could possibly imagine, because he was worried about being taken out by somebody who didn't appreciate how he treated them. And triple mylar windows to stop 50 caliber bullets, the most exquisite electronics which nobody understood and broke down all the time. But the centerpiece were the 6-inch thick doors that protected my bedroom. And I was told twice by my local Flemish security experts that these were the top of the line. They were known as 4th century doors. And it took me at least 2 briefings to gin up enough courage to display my ignorance as to what is a 4th century door. Now, you're all probably wondering, what is a 4th century door and why is it top of the line? Well, what they told me is that a 4th century door was that door which, for 1/2 hour, to allow you to call the police if you're under attack by Al-Qaeda, can withstand anything that could be thrown at it in the 4th century. So you have a picture in your mind of the battering ram and the flaming arrows and I would always ask myself, why the 4th? Why not the 3rd, the 5th, or maybe even better, the 21st? After all. And I was told not to be so stupid as to. But people would laugh, and I would use this, as you are, justifiably laughing. People would use. This has gotten me through many, many dinner speeches, where people would rather laugh and listen to you blather on after a lot of drinks. But one day my PR guy came up to me and said, "You must stop talking about 4th century." I said, "Why?" He said, "You're going to, heap, just disgrace upon yourself, your mission, and your country." I said, "Oh, really? Why?" He said, "Well, there's no such thing as a 4th century door." And I said, "Well, I've been twice briefed." "Well, they're wrong." "Well, what do I have?" He said, "What you have is not a 4th century door, but a forced entry door." So this is Russian collusion, this is military-industrial complex, it's all, you see the whole picture, you got the whole picture. I thought that I would make a couple of opening remarks just to emphasize that this is a dual problem. It's a problem of both foreign and domestic policy. The two are not disparate, they're not unrelated, and I think you can't understand the one without understanding the other. They are of a piece, and they kind of feed each other. And that's what this conference does, is bring both together, and I think that's a very important message. People wonder, well, what is crony capitalism, and what's the definition? And some of my conservative friends, like those at the Federalist Society, don't like the phrase crony capitalism because they think capitalism is a good thing, and that it poisons the concept of capitalism to call it crony capitalism. Well, I like the phrase. I mean, I think not all capitalism is good, especially if it's crony. And so I stick with it, and the Koch brothers use that phrase, and if it's good enough for the Kochs, it's good enough for me. So that's what we'll stick with. So, but what is crony capitalism? Well, it's the incestuous relationship between big business and big government. Incestuous, they kind of feed off each other, that's the problem. The goal is to, for the business community, is to build up barriers to entry, to suppress competition, to get preferences from the big government. And for the big government, it's helpful, and the progressives have always known this, to have a very concentrated industry where you only have to make 2 or 3 phone calls in order to get what you want as a government official. So the two kind of have a symbiotic relationship. This kind of relationship between big business and big government was Adam Smith's biggest nightmare. He really didn't trust the businessmen in Edinburgh, and Wealth of Nations does not encourage crony capitalism, believe me. One way to describe it is to understand the competition protection aspects of this is just to remind people what Jamie Dimon, the chairman of J.P. Morgan, once said about Dodd-Frank, the law that was supposed to regulate the big banks after the crash, and he calls the Dodd-Frank law his moat. And by that, he doesn't mean his M-O-T-E in his eye, but his M-O-A-T around his castle, to protect him from the ugly competition of smaller and perhaps more aggressive banks. And it was the combination of the big banks and their revolving door, which is part of the cause of all this, that led to a real consolidation and poor performance on the part of community banks, which is the largest source of capital for small business, which in turn is the largest source of new jobs. So now there has been recently legislation passed, bipartisan. People don't really appreciate the fact that there has actually been bipartisan legislation which cuts back on some of the advantages that big banks have over the smaller community banks. The problem being community banks can't afford staff to master the intricacies of what the bureaucrats can throw at you. And so legislation was passed. I don't know how effective it's going to be. We'll have to see. I don't think it's possible to have big government abroad, military 24/7 fighting, God knows how many wars, to have a big government abroad and have small government at home. One goes and feeds the other, the surveillance state, so-called deep state, that accompanies the activities abroad and helps it. So there's that symbiotic relationship, and it's not altogether a healthy one. I think the only empire or only great country or city that ever managed to have an empire, in this particular case it was commercial, Venice, was probably the only example of where having a powerful presence abroad, commercial albeit, and naval, didn't mean big government at home. They're the only ones who, I think, successfully navigated that, although they did engage in domestic surveillance. So the Venetians weren't free of people spying and snitting on them. But the conditions of the suppression of small business creation, middle-class jobs, innovation, is what has created the conditions that we now are living through, and they made Trump possible. Trump didn't start all this. Trump's not a cause of all this. Trump is in many ways a product of it. And he's done some things to upset the apple cart, which is what I think the public wanted, and that is part of the reason why there's a lot of turmoil that a lot of people feel. But I think somebody had to come in, or something had to happen, and it won't go away with Trump. It's still going to continue until we get this all sorted out. Something had to be done about the administrative state, both abroad and at home. What you're going to hear today is military-industrial complex on the one hand and big tech on the other. What I'd like to emphasize is that domestically it isn't just big tech, it's a lot of things. It's big banks, it's fed by the revolving door. Goldman Sachs is affectionately known in some circles as government Sachs. But there's a revolving door between the Fed and the big banks. And it's this revolving door which I think is the biggest cause. You hear lots about campaign finance, and that is a part of it. But the biggest part is the revolving door between the big entities and the regulators. And it's well accepted academically. It's called public choice theory, agency capture. There's nothing new about any of this. But I think people tend to forget that there's nothing new and that we can't ignore it and let it continue to happen. Other examples include the insurance industry and healthcare, big pharma and drug innovation. Big pharma not so fast on quick approval of drugs because they like to squeeze the little companies until the little companies run out of money, and then they buy them on cheap, and that's how they somehow do a lot of their invention. It would be better if the drugs were expedited, and I think Scott Gottlieb, now the head of the Food and Drug Administration, is going to tackle that very quickly. There are teacher unions for schools. Many of you probably don't know, but gasoline in the United States is a monopoly, has been for a long, long time. It has about 92% market share when you take into account potential competitors like natural gas or methanol or ethanol or electric cars. The monopoly is basically enforced by EPA. And if you're a competitor, you are limited as to how much you can try to compete against big oil. It's very incestuous, and I think unhealthy relationship. What are the political consequences of this? Well, you could look and see one thing, for example, and I don't know how many in this crowd would consider themselves to be millennials, but I hear from my millennial daughter. She's on the front end of it. She's 33, so she's just barely a millennial, but she tells me that her age group is not much like the neocons, for example, which is something that probably would be music to tax ears to the they don't like it much because they grew up in a period when their peers were, watching the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and so they don't like war 24/7. And what the neocons did was kind of split, imposing with the military-industrial complex on one side and the evangelicals on the other. They kind of split the old Buckley coalition, and that I think has not gotten any attention, and I may not be right in that analysis, but I think it bears some scrutiny. On the domestic side, you'll hear about high tech, big tech. I just was amused to understand recently that Google and Facebook were entirely prepared for the big complex set of privacy rules coming out of Europe. And there was a very amusing Wall Street Journal article about the competition commissioner from the EU coming over here to see, or maybe the internet commissioner coming over here to see how well Silicon Valley was going to cope with these really ambitious privacy goals. And much to her dismay, she found out that Google was probably 1 or 2 steps ahead of Europe, and as soon as the rules were announced, Google's ad revenues shot up dramatically because their competition just said, uncle, white flag, we're out of here, it's all yours, Google. We can't handle the complexity of all this. Now, I don't think the EU intended that, but that's what they've done. Now, what's the cause of this? Is in the view of many of my conservative legal colleagues, it's congressional abdication. They have let their war powers atrophy, so that now they don't do anything about it. We're fighting 5 or 6 wars that should have been approved by Congress but haven't even been voted on. And in domestic policy, they get more and more vague. They have to pass laws, like Nancy Pelosi said, in order to understand what's in them. They don't know what they're doing. They leave lots of gaps, which are treated as ambiguities by the bureaucracies, which they take, and the courts have left them get by with it. An ambiguity is an authorization to extend their power even further, even though there's no authorization for the extension of the power. Just the ambiguity lets them do anything they want. And so the big guys don't tend to dislike this so much. They may scream about it, like Jamie Dimon, but it is their mode. And so in order to get back to a small business entrepreneurship, we have to reduce the size of government. It's as simple as that. And it has to be done on both sides, domestic and foreign. So I think the conference will be very good to show the relationship of the two and how destructive it is to have this problem on our hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyden, for those clear and prescient remarks. With that framework in mind, I'd like to invite the members of our first panel to come forward for a discussion on how cronyism fuels the military-industrial congressional complex. And I will introduce our moderator, who will introduce the rest of the speakers. Mark Perry is a contributing editor to the American Conservative and veteran journalist specializing in the U.S. military and intelligence communities and foreign affairs. He is the author of 9 books, including The Pentagon's Wars, the military's undeclared war against America's presidents. Please welcome Mark Perry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I don't have a a 4th century door story, but I got a couple. Good afternoon, welcome to the American Conservatives Afternoon Conference, Cronyism in Action. But before I give my introductory remarks, let me introduce the panelists, my colleagues. Bryan Bender, who is defense editor at POLITICO. Bryan was previously a reporter for the Boston Globe and Jane's Defense Weekly, where he covered U.S. military operations in the Middle East. He's my, he's okay guy. I come home every once in a while and my wife says, have you read this Bryan Bender piece? Really good. And I go, yeah, he's okay. Bryan is joined by Mandy Smithberger, the director of the Strauss Military Reform Project at the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. Mandy's over there in the end. Also joining us is investigative journalist Gareth Porter, a frequent contributor to the American Conservative, and a winner of the 2012 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. And finally, we are joined by Dorminey, a policy analyst in defense and foreign policy studies at the Cato Institute. This is a good panel, and the reason it's a good panel and the reason they're experts is because they do this for a living. They cover the Pentagon's budget, the defense industry, any number of them, been doing it for their lives, including me. And I'm going to turn the discussion over to our panelists in just a moment. But I thought I'd start out with talking about the military-industrial complex. I'm going to take off my journalism hat and put on the history hat. I wrote a book called Partners in Command. You should buy it. It's a really good book. It's about Eisenhower and Marshall in World War II. And as I was preparing for this panel, I recalled one of the stories I wrote in the book about Eisenhower in North Africa. This was after the invasion of North Africa to take on the Germans. November 1942 was the invasion. And the Battle of Catherine Pass, in the movie Patton says, our first time at bat against the Germans. We were defeated at the Battle of Catherine Pass, and Eisenhower showed up and put his sub-commanders around him, Bradley and Patton, and a number of others, and he said, what the hell happened? And he said, well, our troops were not, morale wasn't what it should be, and you know, command got screwed up, and you know, our soldiers were wet and cold. And he said, well, it rained on the Germans, right? He said, yeah, but, he said, what's the problem? They said, well, we had the wrong ponchos. He said, what? He said, we had the wrong ponchos. He said, well, why do we have the wrong ponchos? Didn't we tell the manufacturer what we needed? And they said, well, yeah, we did, but the manufacturer said they couldn't do that. They'd give us what they had. And I think Eisenhower was so enraged, he said, you know, this is what happens in war. The military dictates what they need, and industry supplies it. Eisenhower had studied this his whole life. He was a great battlefield commander, don't doubt it, but this guy was first and foremost one of the great logisticians of all time. He really knew how to supply troops and what they needed and how to fight wars and the interface between the military and industry. And I think that this North Africa story stayed with him. And he saw it repeated again and again and again as he was president. The Joint Chiefs of Staff would come in and say, well, this is what industry wants us to produce. And he remembered from the North Africa incident when he started to argue about ponchos, they said, well, you know, he recommended that maybe the contract be taken away from the people who supplied the wrong ponchos. And he was told that this would put people on the unemployment line, couldn't do it. I think it nagged at him. I think that this is where the military-industrial complex story speech comes from. And if you study the speech, there are 26 24, I remember the exact number, it was plus 20 drafts of this speech done by him. This wasn't something he gave to his staff to do. He believed this, essentially and absolutely. And the second thing I think that Eisenhower was worried about, the reason that he gave his military-industrial complex speech, was he was worried about threat inflation as a result of his military-industrial complex idea. Because in the early days when he was president, the Navy was always coming in with him talking about how the Russians were building the biggest fleet in the world. It wasn't true. And they had the biggest air force in the world. It wasn't true. We had a better air force. They had more planes. Here was a man who actually cut the defense budget, a general sitting in the Oval Office, and fired those who complained about defense cuts. What he wanted was a better military, not a more expensive one. He was a true conservative. I mean, small c, conservative. So I think that, you know, in my studies of this, in an article I wrote in Politico, there was a 4-star general very recently, 4 years ago, who testified to the Congress that the Russians had developed a tank that was invulnerable to anti-tank weapons. The general was Wesley Clark. I called, and I said, you know, General, this would be the first time in military history that the tank was invulnerable. He said, well, we have to be very careful. If you study the specs of this tank, it is very strong. The tank broke down during the May Day parade in Moscow. The threat inflation is a problem. I had a vice chief of staff of the Army put up a organogram of a brigade combat team. And he said, how many trucks does a brigade combat team, heavy trucks, does a brigade combat team need? I said, I have no idea. He named the figure. Can't remember what it was, 70, 90. I said, I believe you. I have no idea. He said, we have twice that many. I said, why? He said, because we need to employ people. That's the military-industrial complex. So the two things that I hope we can discuss today, my panel is going to discuss a lot of this, is not just the marriage between the military and industry, the cronyism, but the threat inflation that we're suffering under right now, where the enemy appears in the rear and on our flanks all at the same time, and you can never be too prepared. And I have told our panelists also to provide solutions to this problem from their perspective. And so with that short introduction, I told people I'd whinge on, and I have, I apologize. I'm going to turn over to our first panelist for discussion, Bryan Bender. Bryan?
Thanks everybody for coming. To get this conversation going, just a few quick thoughts. To segue off Mark's reference to President Eisenhower, am I not on?
Excuse me, yeah, each of you need to turn your microphone on. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Testing 1, 2. Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. To segue off of Mark's introduction and to get the conversation rolling, I think it's important, as was mentioned earlier, that originally when President Eisenhower gave his farewell address and warned about this huge influence of the arms industry and its incestuous relationship with the military, he originally wanted to use the term military-industrial congressional complex. He was warned against using that and dropped the congressional part because there was some fear that he would piss off Congress. But I think as we begin this conversation, we shouldn't forget that it was an iron triangle, as some would call it. The military, the industry, and the Congress that wants all those jobs. in those districts or those states, whether the military really needs that stuff or not. One aspect of this that I've looked into probably most deeply is the role of the senior military officer who retires and almost uniformly, to use a term, goes into the defense industry in some form. As an executive for a defense company, as a lobbyist, as a consultant for a number of different defense companies. And when I did a big project on this when I was at the Boston Globe, I actually went back to the Eisenhower Library because I was interested in what informed the 5-star general to give this warning. And I found it very interesting that there was an Air Force colonel on his staff who was helping him come up with ideas for this farewell address, who had written a memo with a sort of back of the envelope estimate of a number of thousands of what he called military officers who were leaving the service and going to work for defense companies. And what I found when I did my research is that upwards of 90% of the most senior military officers will, just as they're getting ready to retire, will be recruited by all of the big defense companies. And yes, they're recruiting them for their knowledge. They've spent 30, 40 years in uniform. They know about military affairs. But they're really recruiting them for their Rolodex. And what's interesting is their shelf life, in the view of these companies, is very short. 3, 4, 5 years out, that Rolodex is starting to get dusty. And there's a whole new class of generals that are retiring who can come out and can open doors, get meetings, help formulate their briefings to Congress so they hit all the right notes that they know is going to get support. And I think my biggest takeaway from all of this was that, number one, General Eisenhower would turn over his grave if he knew how much the senior officer corps of the military has effectively been commercialized. If you're a 3 or 4-star general, or even a mid-level officer who has stars in his eyes, or her eyes, the measure of a successful career now in the military is no longer, do I get that 3rd or 4th star? It's what do I do next? Where am I going to go when I'm 55 or 58, in better shape than people half my age, employable for another 20 years? And I think a lot of them do measure it by that defense company job, those 8 consulting gigs, the board memberships at defense companies. And a lot of it is not transparent. So Wesley Clark, my question to Wesley Clark would be, what company is he consulting for that wants to instead build an American tank, or anti-tank missile in this case, that's going to defeat that invincible Russian tank? Because if he's a consultant, there's no disclosure. The general doesn't have to disclose to anybody who he's working for. And he can go on CNN or MSNBC as retired General Wesley Clark, who knows everything, and not have to tell the audience that he's making money working for the very same defense companies who could benefit from this. And then the last thing I would say is that I don't think these guys are bad people. Because I met a lot of them. I talked to these 3 and 4 stars, and I asked them, why did you go into the defense industry? And in the very few cases, asked them why they didn't. And of course, the ones who didn't said, I didn't want to sell my soul. And that's what this effectively was going to be. But again, they're not bad people. I call it, someday I'll write a book about this, and I'll call it patriotic fervor. Because I think if you take them individually, they've spent 30, 40 years serving their country. They have sacrificed a lot. They missed a lot of school events. They barely saw their kids grow up. Many of them went into combat. And this is what they know, and I don't think they see the forest through the trees. They don't see that the system has become a conveyor belt, where you go into the military, you rise through the ranks, you go right out the door, right into the defense company, and then go back and push the next new weapon system to your old buddy, who you may have gotten promoted in the first place, who feels like he needs to do the bidding for you. So I think the solution is more transparency, more disclosure. I think there's virtually no laws on the books that require these senior military officers who are getting a very fat pension of public money to disclose what they're doing for private industry. And I think if they're a lobbyist, they have to disclose it. But very few are lobbyists because they don't need to be. They can just be a consultant and make a whole lot more money than they are if they're lobbyists. So with that, I'm going to
We'll go to Mandy.
Let's close up.
Yep. Mandy?
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, thank you so much for having me. To kind of dovetail off of what Bryan was talking about, there actually are a few laws on the book, but the problem is that they really are ineffective. So when it comes to going to work for a defense contractor, those officers are supposed to, and we shouldn't just let the politicals off the hook either. One of the big problems is that in most cases, political appointees aren't considered to be substantially involved enough in these kinds of contracting decisions to have any kind of recusal for what they do afterwards. But they're supposed to get an ethics decision about what kind of work they can or can't do. And there's a database of those that we've been trying to get made public, so that would at least start to open the conversation about what kind of work these people are doing. But we've seen even in a number of cases when those ethics opinions are in place that they're totally ineffective. Secretary Mattis was a huge advocate for the Theranos company when he was at CENTCOM. He was told that he should not represent the Navy, or represent Theranos before the Navy as a consequence for it, because he was such an advocate. He joined their board anyway. And when you have that kind of message coming from some of the most respected leaders in this field, it sets a pretty awful tone about how you think of your public service and whether it's really just for private gain. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is what are some of the policy impacts that we see and where do we see this kind of coziness occurring. One of the things is that when you have all of these different people, both on the civilian side and in the military side, who are looking for their next job, they are become too cozy with industry. So we've seen things like defense mergers that have resulted in almost no competition. Just for people who like numbers, in fiscal year 2016, 53% of contracts were not competitive at all. And then if you counted ones where there was only a single bidder, more than half, so 60% of the contracts don't have genuine competition. That means that we're not getting real results for the warfighter. We're not getting good results for the taxpayer either. You don't have enough people looking over these things too. And again, it leads to things like huge bundling of contracts so that you only have major corporations that can compete for these things. You have benefits to incoming contractors. You have people writing contracts for themselves, essentially in their civilian position, and then going out to collect a paycheck and a job later. There's almost no enforcement of the laws that are on the book. Some of the changes that we would like to see is that we need to just rewrite our ethics laws to be able to have public transparency. We should have pretty close to uniform standards for everyone as to what the expectations are. So looking at things like a 2-year or 5-year cooling off period, so making sure that people aren't benefiting off of those relationships for public service. So then if, the argument you always hear from industry is that, yeah, these people are being hired for their expertise and all of that kind of thing. If that's the case, then we don't have to worry about it. And
it would be amazing to see how many 3 and 4 stars would not get hired if they had to wait 5 years.
Yeah. And you even have a system where there's this program called From the Battlefield to the Boardroom that is to help military officers find their next corporate gig. You won't be surprised that many of them end up going to work for defense contractors, that those are the people who are coming to them. I think that we also need to look at other private companies and that they should be doing a better job in reaching out to a lot of these leaders too, because they do have a lot of expertise. They do have great management skills. I come from the nonprofit sector. I know that management is not expertise. It's not something that you frequently find in a lot of industries. So I think these people can still serve, the public interest in all kinds of ways. And it's just unfortunate that that seems to be the culture, and that you seem to be some kind of schmuck if you aren't going to work for a defense contractor afterwards. And then as a result of all of these things, it's also important to look at the role of Congress in this. I briefly worked on Capitol Hill for a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Almost everyone who was a legislative assistant with me now, if they've left the Hill, they're almost all lobbyists. One ran for Congress, And that's the culture that you see, that people are making these kinds of policy decisions, writing the rules for how these contracts are going to be awarded, looking towards what their next job is going to be. Thanks.
So thank you all for being here today, and thank you especially to the American Conservative for putting on this panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's kind of new and exciting in this field, and don't get me wrong, there's tons that's new and exciting in this field, but the Pentagon audit that was announced earlier this year is really going to bring to light a lot of these issues, or at least in my opinion is really going to bring to light a lot of these issues. It's something that this community fought really hard for years on, and civil society put pressure on members of Congress, and I think a big contributing factor was getting Comptroller Norquist and to some extent Secretary Mattis on board, and you get frequent statements from them about, we want cost-cutting measures, we want to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, we want to root these things out, we want to be more efficient. And so I think it's really has come about through a lot of activism and advocacy on the part of civil society, but also really met with a desire to have this happen from within government. And so we really finally got movement on that. So we're going to have to see, the first initial findings are going to come out probably November or December, although it's the government, so that might be delayed. So we'll have to kind of wait and see what the findings are going to be like in order to really dive down deep into the data. But good work is really being done in the Pentagon right now on balancing the books and trying to make sure that there is some level of accountability with a lot of really troubled programs. So in terms of what is actually going to change, we'll have to wait and see what the government puts out. But what could it mean? You can make educated guesses. I don't think there's going to be anything, I don't think there's going to be a gross violation. I don't think there's going to be a ton of waste, fraud, and abuse that we don't already know about. There's not going to be one huge singular program that if we just got this in line, then we could balance the whole budget and everything would be great. I think, the most common abusers are already known to us. We've got a troubled F-35 program. We've got a troubled littoral combat ship program. Those things are going to continue to be factors. But what this offers is a chance to get a lot of the smaller programs better aligned moving forward. And I think we're already seeing a little bit of that as this audit happens in a piecemeal fashion of waste that is being identified is actually being, funds are being moved, they're going to be used in different ways, they're going to free up funding for other programs, it's going to be reallocated in a more efficient fashion. And I think the people within the Pentagon are really motivated to do this. But I think, a lot of it is going to be dependent on what is actually publicly available. I would also love for this audit to kind of put to bed the waste, fraud, and abuse argument. And I think that's a really strong point of having the audit done is once it is done, once our books are balanced, once we realize what we have to do to change things, I would love to move the conversation in a new direction, away from waste, fraud, and abuse, waste, fraud, and abuse, waste, fraud, and abuse. Let's have a constructive conversation about what we want our force to be 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, 50 years down the line, and let's fund that appropriately. But right now, I think members of Congress are so, fixated on fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, and we can, make gains that way, that people are really overlooking the larger strategic conversation that we could be having now. It's a really pivotal point in our history, and I think, we're nearing fiscal year 2020, we're trying to get fiscal year 19 and DAA on the books. We're gonna have to quickly decide if we're gonna pivot back to near peer competition. That's gonna change our force structure. What do we want to invest in? What do we want to divest of? What should we be prioritizing in the new technology that we're funding? And so I would really love for this audit to also bring about a much larger strategic conversation. But this really fundamentally depends on how much data will actually be available in an open source fashion. Members of civil society, we can't adequately critique what the government is doing without data, without transparency. We need the numbers to see what they're doing in order to make an outside analysis, in order to have that critique. And so we're really going to be dependent on how much is really going to be available from the audit in order to make valid criticisms. And that's true not just in the Pentagon audit. You need transparency and you need data available to the public in order to, do larger budgetary things, more information on even what you would see as the most simple thing, as like the cost of the B-21, the new long-range strike bomber, is still highly classified. We have no information on what that plane is going to cost us, not just to build, but also to operate. 30% roughly of the life cycle costs of any new program is in the initial acquisition costs, what you've got to do in order to get a plane off the production line. The remaining 70% of the life cycle cost is how much they're going to spend to operate and sustain. That's training the pilots, that's fuel, that's flight hours. You're just seeing a small snapshot in terms of acquisition costs, but in order to really take into account the full picture, you need data on that. It's not just budget issues, it's not just Pentagon issues, it's even things like foreign policy. I mean, under the Trump administration, there has been rollbacks of what's available. And so I would love to see more transparency in this administration and, where the troop numbers are, how they're deployed. I work a lot on the international arms trade like Bryan does as well. And, what we sell commercially to foreign nations is kind of a black box. There aren't good numbers available on that. And it's slowly creeping backwards and backwards and backwards. And I would love a return to transparency so that the people up on this panel can continue doing what we're doing and offering that valuable critique, because without access, there can be no constructive conversation. And I think that's really going to be a pivotal point in the coming years. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you very much for mounting this discussion today. Thanks for the American Conservatives' sponsorship of it, which I think is a sign of its continuing to be extremely relevant to the most important issues in national security policy. I agree, of course, with the rest of the panelists that the military-industrial complex has been fueled by the problem of the cozy relationship between the federal government's military institutions, Pentagon, and private sector corporations that are involved in contracting for them. We know that this has been a problem, as Mark said at the outset here, for many, many decades, going back to the early period of the Cold War and even before that. And it's resulted in bad decisions on choices of weapon system, weapons that we didn't really need, weapons that didn't work very well, and a lot of other associated problems. But what I want to talk about is a new set of issues that have arisen with the onset of what I call the permanent war era, which began after, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. It was followed then by a whole series of U.S. military engagements around the Middle East. I was trying to make sure that I knew precisely how many countries the United States is actively militarily engaged in today, and as best I can tell for sure it's 7, but I have a feeling that is incomplete. That's the number of countries where the United States is actually bombing, or we know that they're bombing. But it's possible, it's likely that there are more than that. And that era of permanent war, really enabled by a permissive political environment after 9/11 and the Bush administration's propaganda using basically anti-terrorism, counterterrorism as a reason for justification for going to war in a number of places, has really altered fundamentally the consequences of this cozy relationship, this crony capitalism that certainly does exist. And what I think we have now is a toxic mixture, a toxic combination, if you will, which is a reflection of the coincidence of between the era of, or the onset of permanent war on one hand, and the acceleration of this relationship, cozy relationship between military and intelligence officials on one hand and the contractors on the other. Brian Bender's wonderful, important work on the revolving door in the Pentagon shows that there was a dramatic, remarkable acceleration of the revolving door in the Pentagon once that sort of permanent war period began, doubling, if I remember correctly, from roughly 45% to more than 80%, roughly 80%, did I get that right, in the years that followed. So this is just one of the bits of evidence that we are now faced with a much more serious problem that has not just to do with waste, fraud, and abuse, not just picking the wrong weapon systems or unnecessary weapon systems. It has to do with real serious damage to the security of Americans. And I think that is the issue that has really remained unexamined. And when we get to the point of talking about what needs to be done, I think that's where I want to put the emphasis. And I want to just talk about two examples here of how this nexus between the contractors' interests and the interests of the generals, the civilians in the Pentagon and the NSA and the CIA, because the intelligence community, intelligence agencies are even more seriously affected by the revolving door and the abuses that have gone with that. The two cases that I want to talk about of how this problem has really affected U.S. national security very directly. First of all, the situation that I think many of you already know about with regard to the NSA and Bill Binney's team, which came up with a technology that they actually were ready to deploy. They knew it was deployable. They demonstrated it to Congressional Oversight officials who said, yes, this is what we need. And General Hayden, the director of NSA, refused to deploy that. Instead, he wanted a system that didn't exist, that he wanted to have the top contractors of the NSA produce over a period of years. Well, he tried for about 5 years, and nothing ever came of it. He finally had to abandon it. Why did he do this? Because of the privatization that the NSA was so fond of, which I think went farther and faster in the NSA than anywhere else in the military and intelligence agencies, and which caused the top leadership then to bring in people from Booz Allen Hamilton, where they had gone after working in the NSA, came back to the NSA to work on this problem, and of course, guess what? They wanted to have Booz Allen Hamilton be the quarterback of the team of top contractors who would produce this system. Well, we know the consequences. As a result of that, the intelligence community failed to detect the evidence, the clear evidence of the presence of al-Qaeda terrorists in the United States who carried out the 9/11 attacks. Now, of course, it's true that there was other evidence that perhaps should have been caught, was not caught, that the CIA and the FBI had. Nevertheless, this is a clear example of how U.S. national security was directly affected by this phenomenon that we are dealing with today. The other case, which is much less known, I think, has to do with the drone war. Now, I'll be very brief about this, and then I'll stop. It's well established now from many, many sources, and many people who have worked on this within the U.S. national security agencies, understand that drones cannot bring security, they cannot defeat terrorism, they can only make it worse. This has been the observation of innumerable experts and people who have been involved in it, including people who were directly involved at the site which was conducting the drone war. This is their judgment. Nevertheless, the contracts keep rolling year after year. This has become the most popular element of US national security policy. The CIA, of course, wanted to get more involved in it. They built whole programs around it, whole career paths around it. And of course, again, you have the revolving door in the CIA with people going in and out who have a direct interest in very lucrative contracts for the drone war. These are the most lucrative contracts now that are existing. They're so hot, and there's such an enormous future there. So the point is that the drone war is a threat to US security, not an answer to US security problems. So I simply want to emphasize that we are involved here in really new territory, that there's a lot that needs to be done about. And so let's roll up our sleeves and work on it.
I'll take the, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and begin the questions, if I may. And then we're going to turn it over to you. And I guess this is for the whole panel, but I'm kind of focused on what Caroline said, because I think it's true that we're in an interesting period where it's now, I've noticed, maybe Gareth might disagree, but I've noticed that there's a greater willingness now to question military claims, defense claims. And we live in an interesting period where people are now starting to focus on, as a 3-star told me a couple weeks ago for an article which I hope will appear in Foreign Policy in the next couple of days, is that there's a growing anxiety in the military that after 17 years of the war on terrorism, we haven't quite gotten this right. And not only have we not quite gotten it right, but our Air Force is, just as an example, our Air Force has been in the air since 1993. Things are wearing out. Readiness is in an all-time, I won't say low, but it's, we're short 2,000 flyers in the Air Force. For me, the Air Force is you take the pulse of the military, I look at the Air Force. There's real anxiety and discomfort with the way things are going, how much we're spending, and whether we're spending it correctly. So I agree that this is kind of an opportunity. That's not a question, just a long disquisition. Let me just say I served as political director of the landmine campaign back during the Peloponnesian Wars, 1997. And we were never going to win that campaign to ban landmines by arguing that our military didn't need landmines. Landmines kill people, and the military buys weapons that kill people. But we damn near got it. We damn near got it. And we damn near got it because we were able to argue to the military that the use of landmines actually endangers American soldiers ever as much as it endangers the enemy. And we were able to show it. Maneuver battalions during the Iraq War not crossing minefields of our mines that were spent because of the danger of losing people. And if you can make a national security argument to the military, you can win. You can win. And so my question for Caroline is, I tend to say what Eisenhower said when he cut his defense budget in the last couple of years of his presidency, and he said, we need the military to make choices. We have to force the services to make choices. You can have this tank, you can have this armored carrier, you can't have both at the numbers that you want. You can have this and this and this, but you can't have, if you want that, you can't have this. So my kind of solution to the transparency which you emphasized is, let's do what happened after World War II when we had to make difficult choices. And after the Cold War, we had to make difficult choices. Just cut the budget. Cut the budget by $100 billion and tell the services, here's, redefine what we have to do. All right, if we can't fight 2.5 wars with $100 billion, how many wars can we fight? Are they worth it? And who's the enemy? What's the threat? What weapons do you need? But I think that, your appeal to transparency is absolutely right, and to asking the services and Defense Department, tell us who the enemy is and what strategies we should adopt. So, but is that a rational kind of approach to achieving the transparency that you talk about?
So I think in part it is. I think in this current political climate, you're not going to get people to agree to cut the budget first and then work top down, but I agree that there needs to be prioritization, because that's what our military is currently lacking. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people think that our military is run down, our military is depleted, and if that is true, then more money will fix some of those problems. It would help with readiness, but I think, at the root of that is that our military is overburdened. Over-deployed. We're asking it to do 1 million different mission sets all equally. We want them to be good at everything that we could possibly need from them. And it's not realistic, and it's not fundable long-term. Restraint is going to be more and more a fiscal reality for us in the coming years. And, I'm not talking in the next 1 to 2 years. I'm talking in the next 50, because that's how long you buy force structure. We have aircraft carriers that are good for at least 50 years. We can even extend their life 60, 70. The planes, the ships, the missions that you decide now are going to create our force for an incredibly long period of time. And so I think the way that you get that prioritization is looking not just at how we're funding things, but also at what we're asking and looking at the mission sets. It's a project that I'm working on at the Cato Institute right now, is what we're asking for in our best interest. Is it feasible? Can our military do it if we ask that of them? And then ask, are we funding this appropriately? Because I think you have to have all of those things in line. It's an equation, not just a singular problem with a singular root. And I think once you pare down a lot of the missions that we're currently asking for, you can have a much smaller budget. You can have a lot better prioritization, because I think right now our resources are they're spread too thin. We're asking too much. And now is the time to really think strategically about it. We're heading into the 2020s, and the government evaluates things on 5 to 10 year timelines. Now is the time to make these hard calls, and they are going to be hard calls, and they're going to be political calls. And we have to have advocates within civil society and in Congress and in the administration who want to solve this problem, because I think a lot of people can see that something is awry, but no one has a fix-it solution. And I don't think there is an easy Band-Aid for this. It's going to be a total overhaul type of deal. I think you're 100% right. The time is now, and we need to think about it in a broader strategic context, not in a 1-year budgetary context, not in a 2-year deal. We need to think much longer term.
Bryan?
I'm skeptical. A couple of points. Number one, I think even those of us who cover this world often forget. I forget who it was who once described the Pentagon as a social services agency that sometimes fights wars. The vast majority of the Pentagon budget is not weapon systems. It is people, it is healthcare, it is chicken in the mess hall. It's these massive service contracts that go on forever. And they're not necessarily Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, although they've gotten smart and they've gotten into the defense services business. When I say I'm skeptical, it's on a couple points. The audit, I think, there's no doubt auditing the Pentagon makes total sense. I mean, the idea that this government agency has never passed an audit is mind-boggling. But I have no faith that we're going to see the kinds of things that you talked about, where we're going to somehow see where all the waste, fraud, and abuse is, cut it out, and then have a conversation about, well, what is our military actually supposed to be doing, and what should we be funding versus what shouldn't we be funding, you're already seeing an audit industrial complex grow up around the audit. They're going to spend $1 billion on this audit. Every accounting firm has hired every lobbyist in town to get a piece of that pie. They're going to audit the Pentagon now forever because it's going to be a lot of money for contractors. And there's evidence, strong evidence, I haven't been able to prove it yet, but I'm working on it, that the Defense Logistics Agency, which is like the poster child for the audit, is hiding things. They're hiding things from Ernst & Young because it's uglier than we even think. And they know that if they really reveal all this stuff, that they're going to have to pay, there's going to be hell to pay. So I think, I would say in some ways, the approach should be the opposite. What we need is leadership and a public that actually gives a shit to have the conversation about what is our military for first. Because there's no political will to cut the budget. And as long as it's, a social services agency that sometimes fights wars, Congress is never going to cut it. They're never going to cut $100 billion in the budget. There's no way. I mean, they would lose their congressional seats. They would lose all their campaign contributions from Lockheed and Northrop and everybody else. I think the only way forward is a real conversation about what is America's role in the world. The military is beaten to death, probably because it's doing a lot of things that maybe if we had a real conversation about it, it shouldn't be doing.
Yep.
Or we should be doing more in concert with allies, or finding some other way to do it. A little bit of that conversation, I'd be interested in Mark's take on this, is kind of happening. The forever war is going on forever, but the defense contractors don't make any money off it anymore. They're not interested in the forever war. I think we're in the forever war because we don't know what to do instead, because we haven't had that bigger conversation. The peer competitor, the shift to China, Russia, that's the new thing, because that's big money. That's more fighters, that's more ships, that's more subs, more missile defenses. Because you know what? We're sick of that 17-year-old war that we kind of didn't win. And we don't really see a way to win it, but we can't really get out of it, so we're going to kind of do it on the cheap. And oh, by the way, we're going to privatize it as much as we can. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer, but I think unless there's a bigger debate by Congress, because they raise and lower armies and navies about what the hell this is all about, I don't know that much is going to change at all.
Question to you, Bryan, about what you just said on the fact that, or the idea that contractors do not make, I don't know if you said much money.
Well, certainly
they
not
still make
the
money.
solid days of the Iraq War, where the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, the slush fund for the war.
Right, of course, there were lots of troops.
Triple, quadruple what it is now.
Right, of course.
Right, but we still, we have more contractors on the ground than we have troops. So that's part of the hidden cost that people don't really consider about the cost of these wars. And that's why members of Congress don't really feel like they have to debate these issues, because who cares if it's Eric Prince and his team, right?
Right.
I just wanted to make the point that the revolving door that you were so eloquent in writing about has the effect that, the consequence that those officials who make the decisions on what we're going to do in Iraq, in Afghanistan, are going to continue to give lucrative contracts for all kinds of things, which are not in the interest of the United States, but they're in their interest because they're thinking about their next job, as you've pointed out. I have no doubt that contracts are still being let that provide a very clear incentive for the United States to continue these wars. The war in Afghanistan, there's no reason for it to continue except for people to make money. There's no other reason for this. It's not like the United States is going to win the war. It's not like the United States is protecting its security by fighting in Afghanistan. What other reason is there except for contractors?
Pride is a powerful human emotion. Some of it is we've invested 17 years in this. And by the way, the generals who run the wars now, they've served 3, 4, 5 their whole lives have been invested in this. Their buddies have died. They don't want to give it up, so the generals kind of stick with it, and they keep briefing the president, we got to stay, we got to go, this new surge is going to work, Mr. President, we promise, even though we've done it 10 times already. I'm just saying it's more complicated than that. It's not just about making money because, you know, preparing for a war with China or Russia is a hell of a lot more lucrative than fighting a war in Afghanistan. If you're the big defense companies and you're running this crony capitalism, I don't think the people in the marketing or the business development department are like, man, we need to keep this war going for another 20 years.
But just a quick rejoinder, I mean, if you go back to 2008, 2009, when you know, you had a transition where Petraeus went in there in Afghanistan, 2010, you know, he was I think, realistic pretty quickly that the United States could not win this war. And although, of course, prestige is involved in it, you know, there was an enormous sort of bow wave of spending on all kinds of things in Afghanistan that went with the troop surge and all that. And that, in other words, there's a generation of, there's a process of generating self-perpetuating programs. I mean, that's the way the system works. It's self-perpetuating programs. And so it's, I agree it's not simple, but everything about that war is ultimately linked to the fact that it's so lucrative for a lot of people.
We're going to go to the audience, finally. And so we'll, yes, sir, your hands first.
Yes, a microphone?
Yes.
Yeah, I think to get earthbound, you got to understand what the nature of Congress is. We talk about a debate on priorities and what our national security posture ought to be. You can't even get a debate from the leadership on any single war. I know that Congressman Walter Jones and written 5, 6, 7 letters to Paul Ryan. We need to at least debate these things. They won't permit debate at all. And Tom Massey has described when the Defense Department comes in to do the briefings with the members with regard to a weapons acquisition program, the last page is the number of jobs and contracts in their district. And all the members look at that page and nothing else. And they go ahead and vote for it if it provides them jobs. And with regard to the financial crisis, they just borrow the money. We're running trillion-dollar deficits and no one cares on both sides. And one of the things that's discouraging, it's these kinds of issues were not even in the presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. It was just marginalized. And I agree that the analysis is right on. We're going off a cliff. And nobody seems to care. They talk about, you know, in the threat inflation is characteristic, and it's the motto in the national security industry is, it's bad to lose a friend, but a catastrophe to lose an enemy, right? Because then that loses the justification for all of your substantial military-industrial complex spending. So I don't, and how do you get Congress to care? They don't. I've been up there in Gareth, it's 15,000 times. They don't want to vote on anything. They feel that they can get themselves more solidified by avoiding controversy than otherwise. And that seems an insoluble problem.
Yes, sir. In the back there, I think your hand was upside.
Thank you. Jody Vittori from Transparency International and Carnegie. Had 2 quick questions. One is, what is the role do you think that the push for more defense exports to countries is going to play, particularly to the Middle East, given the tremendous instability and warfare going on there? And second is, I wanted to hear your thoughts on, as Transparency International looks at how different countries deal with influence. Many countries do not allow either industry at large or defense industry to provide campaign donations to their parliaments or whatever equivalents. In many countries, either directly or through PACs or other means. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that for the U.S.
On the second one, it used to be that the United States didn't allow that either. And that changed in the 70s.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great if we could bring that back. I mean, a lot of people would lose a lot of money in terms of campaign donations, but it would go a long way in towards of getting more ethical, fair campaigns. In terms of defense exports to the Middle East, I am worried about the new conventional arms transfer policy that the administration has debuted, just because it lends itself to transactional enforcement. I think that people actually within the government are doing their utmost to make sure that negative consequences are mitigated in some fashion, but I don't think they currently have the capacity to do that, in part because their bureaucracy is so convoluted. The process of getting things pushed through has so many areas of just logjam, and things don't actually, most of the time you don't even get a no. If an arms sale doesn't want to move forward, they just let it wither on the vine in the midst of this bureaucracy. So how do you go about having a cohesive strategy in this area if you can't even get the bureaucracy to work for you in an efficient way? So I am worried about the message that the administration is sending in terms of more transactional nature to American defense exports, because I would hate for America to take more part in violence abroad, in conflict abroad, in human rights abuses abroad. I don't want that for my country on a fundamental level. And so I really hope that the way that it is enforced is in a positive manner. I think that there is some wiggle room in how this new policy is going to be implemented. And so, I do have faith in, the people that are currently working in government are trying their best. And just like I have faith in the members of Congress that, they are trying their best to have some of these discussions, and you get a few champions on each issue, but they are also trying to handle a large volume of issues. And so I think you really need that perfect alignment of civil society being informed, transparency so that we can be informed, and then champions on the Hill and in the White House. I think you need those things in order to affect change. And I'm hopeful that enough people get behind an issue that there can be change. I believe that fundamentally. I have hope.
Yeah. We're talking now about what we need to do. Is that on the floor?
Yeah, it's on the floor.
Okay. I want to make a little intervention on this because it's so critical, in my view, to getting something changed. And this is really directed to conservatives generally, including if there's anybody here from the Koch brothers. I want to pinpoint their role. The idea that we have to have a popular movement to exert pressure for change is absolutely critical. It's central to this. And I've gone to a couple or three of the foreign policy conferences, and the atmosphere or the tenor of the discussion was extremely elitist. It was top down completely or top to top. And that's not going to work. I think everything that everybody here has said on both sides of these microphones is in agreement that it's not going to work. You have to have pressure from the people, and that we don't have that now. We need need new ideas about how to generate popular resistance, popular opposition. I think that's where we need to go with this discussion starting right now. We need a movement of voters that really is focused on where they're coming from, appeals to what they're worried about, what they're feeling, that goes beyond what has been done thus far in the past, and is really targeting voters where it's going to matter. That's not being done now. So I think that's really the concept that we need to start with.
Somebody else from the audience, please. All the way in the back, please. Or, no. Go ahead.
I have it first, thanks. I'm John Utley with the American Conservative magazine. I was just searching sequestration, only way to cut defense waste. My article is at the top of the search engine, but I wrote it 6 years ago, and it was, one of you all said, sequestration is the only way, and they hated it so much, and Trump got rid of it. But can you all elaborate a bit on coming back to that, having it again? it still was having a very slight effect.
I think sequestration was an interesting case study in this whole universe, really, because at the time, after the House, after the Tea Party did so well in the elections, it came in and was adamant about cutting government spending, and they mandated these spending caps that affected every agency, including the Pentagon. I recall there being these sky is going to fall warnings from the Pentagon that made it sound like the Chinese would be in San Francisco Bay next week. The Chinese Navy was going to take over the West Coast. And the truth is, none of their warnings ever came true. And I always thought, you know, nobody's really called them out on their credibility, because in the end, the Pentagon figured out how to deal with it. They actually made choices. They had to cut and shift and move money from here to there to make sure that they had what they needed for the most important things. So I think in some ways sequestration, yes, it's not the best way to go about cutting the budget. You'd rather have a more strategic assessment rather than just slicing it off the top. But I think it actually served a really good purpose. And it's actually connected in a way to the earlier question about commercial sales and foreign military sales to other countries. I think a lot of those sales are going up year after year after year. And the administration, not just this administration, but even the Obama administration, was looking for ways to relax some of the export controls under a lot of lobbying from the defense industry, because they look at the Pentagon budget and they see that it's, at least in those days, it was, you know, under budget limits and strained and fighting all these wars, and there's not a whole lot more money for these big ticket items. So hey, let's go sell them to whoever wants them overseas. So I actually think that's in some ways a bigger crony capitalism problem, where you have every general who ever oversaw foreign military sales leaves uniform and goes to work for Lockheed or Northrop in their international sales department. They have all the contacts in all the Middle Eastern countries, all the Asian countries. But I think that was a function in some ways of the companies realizing that the Pentagon budget was not going to be all that lucrative anymore for the big stuff.
Yeah, no, we've seen that also with the attaches, and we're starting to get through the Freedom of Information Act. There's an emolument clause that applies to retired military officers as well, and if they're going to receive money from a foreign government, even if that's through a contractor, they have to get permission from both their service and the State Department to do so. So we learned that James Mattis was an advisor to the UAE. A number of officers who are going to be helping with all of these Raytheon systems in the UAE as well.
Yeah, let me just, before we take another question, I will do the Bryan Bender statement on what Gareth said. I'm skeptical of, I'm just skeptical of the American public going out there and overwhelmingly voting for what amounts to smaller budgets for the Pentagon, when every baseball game I go to in the fourth inning you stand up to pay homage to those who served. It's just not there yet. It might be. And I want to follow up a little bit on Carol. I think that a lot of this depends on leadership, and I am a little bit optimistic. I shouldn't be in the face of all the evidence. There are people in our military at the highest level who know what's going on and are willing to talk about it. And they don't do it publicly, but they do it. And the Secretary of Defense last year put a gag order on the senior military that they are not to talk in public about readiness problems. The ostensible reason being that we didn't want to communicate to our enemies that we had readiness problems. The gag order confirmed to our enemies, whoever they might be, that we do have readiness problems, but never mind. So you'll find now that during hearings, when we talk about readiness, they want to go into a confidential session, unheard of. And the problem isn't that he's worried about communicating to our enemies that we have readiness problems. What I think James Mattis is worried about is that even though we've had defense budget increases, one passed last night, $718 billion, correct? $718 billion. Even though we have these defense budget increases, our readiness problems continue. And the reason the readiness problems continue is not because we don't have because we had sequestration. It's because we're in too many countries. And there are people in the military who will say that in private. And it needs to be said in public. We got to get out of these wars. That's, I think, for a lot of very senior officers, including 4-star officers in the Air Force, will tell you. I can't talk to you about readiness, but if you want to talk about over-deployment, I'll do that. Same thing. Anyway, yes, sir. Another question.
Can you guys? Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah. Go ahead. We're good.
Okay. I'm Austin Ferrick from Open Markets. If you guys would talk about consolidation among contractors. In particular, Matt Stoller mentioned to me the other day about the famous Bill Clinton, what is it called, Last Supper, where they were told to go from like 20 contractors down to 4 or 5, and how that's impacted all this.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good crony capitalism story for you, because one of the architects of that norm, Augustine, then was able to collect his job at Lockheed Martin as a favor for that merger that occurred. So you see that there is really no competition occurring as a result. I believe it's something like the top 5 federal contractors receive 50% of defense spending, and so that you really don't have you need to have fly-offs, you need to have competition. We just understand that these market principles are essential for having real options and choices, so we can't even reassess.
And it's 80% of the intelligence contracts go to the 5 top contractors. Just, take that and emphasize the point quickly.
I have a little bit of a different view, maybe, which is that, obviously more competition is innately better. But I sometimes find it ironic that people complain that we made the defense industry smaller, but, we hate the defense industry. So would it be better if we had 20 defense companies and 20 more production lines that the military doesn't need, that the Congress would fund anyway? So I'm not so sure that it would be that much better. I think it would be different. And there's no doubt that, there's a lot of weapon system contracts. There's really only 1 or 2 companies that could do it. So if one doesn't win it this time, they get the next one. A former Secretary of Defense once told me that to understand the Pentagon, you have to understand one thing, and that is it's the largest socialist economy outside of China. In other words, everybody will get their share eventually, no matter what. So I'm not convinced, I guess, that the consolidation in the late 90s was that terrible, because I feel like you just have 20 more Lockheed Martins and 20 more companies that would be wasting money.
I don't know. I'd kind of like to see what Lockheed A versus Lockheed B would do. You need to have some level of options, and especially considering that Congress isn't willing to look at any kind of foreign companies and alternatives that will occur there.
Could we call on Pierre Spray, who was an expert on this, to comment?
Let me tell you, the consolidation that Bill Perry started with the last sector has been a disaster. The consolidation that Bill Perry started with the Last Supper has been an utter disaster for the quality of American weapons. And this, in part, it's not just the question of competition and so on. By creating these mega monster conglomerates that do everything, like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, they do electronics, they do ground vehicles, they do missiles and so on. We have totally destroyed the capability of the country to design a decent fighter airplane or a decent close support airplane, or even to some extent a decent rifle. The consolidation goes way beyond this question. I totally agree with you that the way our system has worked, when you have 20 production lines, the Pentagon has always tried to fill them up, and often with uselessness. But that's quite aside from the question of what consolidation does to technical competence. And consolidation, as with the huge intelligence contractors too. Obviously there are small intelligence contractors that have something to offer, have something of value, because they have innovative people, just like small drug companies do. And when you consolidate all that, you've killed technical competence and innovation. So what Bill Perry started was an utter disaster for the country. And I find it ironic that today, now that he's made all that money out of having helped that as an investment banker, he's now saying, well, we've gone too far in consolidation today.
That's going to be the last word. We have to move on to our next event. Thank you all. I'm glad we were able to solve this problem.
Thank you.